I found my husband's 25-year-old assistant sitting in our dining room that crisp September morning. When Olivia looked at me with those cold blue eyes and said, "Your husband is having my baby," I thought my world had ended. By sunset, they would both learn what it means to underestimate the wrong woman. Before we dive deeper into this story, tell me where you're watching from in the comments. If stories of resilience touch your heart, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something truly powerful to share with all of you. The cherry wood dining table we'd picked out 5 years ago. The fresh sunflowers I'd arranged just yesterday in the ceramic vase from our anniversary trip to Italy. Everything looked surreal as I stared at Olivia Parker, my husband's young assistant, perched on one of our dining chairs like she belonged there. She couldn't have been more than 25, with perfectly styled auburn hair and wide blue eyes that made her look even younger. The contrast between us couldn't have been more stark. Me in my robe and slippers, hair still messy from sleep, and her in a tailored black dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly grocery budget. My husband Greg's taste in women had apparently become as expensive as his taste in watches and cars after his recent promotion to chief financial officer. "I'm sorry to come here like this," Olivia said, her voice trembling slightly, but there was something in her eyes that didn't match her apologetic tone. "But I thought you should know. Greg and we've been seeing each other for almost 8 months, and now I'm expecting his child." The words hit me like a physical blow, but 15 years as a litigation attorney had taught me how to keep my composure even when my world was crumbling. I gripped the edge of the counter, my knuckles turning white, but my voice remained steady. "Does Greg know you're here?" Olivia shook her head, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. "No, I wanted to tell you first. I thought you deserved to know before everyone at Parker Financial finds out." How considerate, I thought bitterly. The woman who had been sleeping with my husband for 2/3 of a year suddenly developed a conscience. But something about her demeanor, the way she sat in my dining room with such confidence, told me this wasn't about conscience at all. This was about marking territory. "I see," I said, walking to the coffee maker with measured steps. "And I assume you've taken a pregnancy test? Seen a doctor?" "Yes to both," she replied, pulling out an ultrasound picture from her designer purse. "I'm 10 weeks along. Greg was. Well, he was surprised when I told him yesterday, but he said he'd handle everything. He promised we'd figure it out together." I wanted to laugh at the naivety in her voice. Greg Matthews, CFO of Parker Financial Group, didn't figure things out together with anyone. He calculated, manipulated, and controlled. I should know. I'd been married to him for 12 years. "Would you like some coffee?" I asked, my voice perfectly pleasant. "Oh, I'm sorry. Probably not in your condition." Olivia's smile faltered slightly. She clearly hadn't expected this reaction. Where was the screaming? The tears? The dramatic confrontation she had undoubtedly rehearsed in her mind? "No, thank you," she said, suddenly looking uncertain. "I should probably go. I thought you should hear it from me." "That's very thoughtful of you," I replied, pouring myself a cup of coffee with steady hands. "And Olivia, one more thing before you go." She paused halfway out of the chair, looking at me expectantly. "You might want to ask Greg about the Matthews family trust, specifically the infidelity clause his grandmother insisted on including. It's quite interesting reading material." I took a sip of my coffee, savoring the moment as the confidence in her eyes flickered, replaced by something that looked like fear. Good. She should be afraid. Because while she had been playing house with my husband, dreaming of a future funded by Matthew's money, she had no idea who she was really dealing with. I watched her hurry out of my dining room, her designer heels clicking against the hardwood floors. As the front door closed behind her, I pulled out my phone and dialed a familiar number. "Jennifer, it's Kate. I need you to pull every file we Have on the Matthews Family Trust and get me an appointment with Judge Reynolds, the one who oversees the trust. It's time to remind my husband exactly what he stands to lose. The game had begun, and I was about to show them both that hell hath no fury like a woman who knows exactly how to use the law to her advantage. Greg might be the financial wizard, but I hadn't spent 15 years specializing in trust and estate law for nothing. Preparing this story took us many hours, so if you're finding value in it, please tap that like button. It truly means the world to us. Now, let's get back to how this all unfolded. After Olivia left, I sat at my kitchen island, mind racing with possibilities. The Matthews Family Trust wasn't just any trust. It was a $75 million empire built by Greg's grandmother, Eleanor Matthews, a woman who had survived 2 cheating husbands and had made absolutely certain her grandchildren wouldn't benefit from similar behavior. The infidelity clause wasn't just a suggestion, it was ironclad. I pulled up the trust documents on my laptop, though I hardly needed to review them. I had helped Eleanor revise them 4 years ago, something Greg had conveniently forgotten. My fingers traced the words on the screen as I recalled Eleanor's voice. Make it bulletproof, Kate. Some lessons need to be expensive to be learned. The front door opened, and I heard Greg's familiar footsteps. He was home early. Olivia must have called him. I didn't turn around, keeping my eyes fixed on the laptop screen as he entered the kitchen. Kate, he said, his voice carrying that smooth, controlled tone he used with difficult clients. We need to talk. I took another sip of my coffee, still not looking at him. About your pregnant assistant, or about how you're about to lose your share of the family trust? There was a moment of silence, then the sound of him setting his briefcase down. She told you. It wasn't a question. She did more than tell me, Greg. She came to our home, sat in our dining room, and showed me the ultrasound. I finally turned to face him, taking in his expensive suit, his perfectly styled salt and pepper hair, the way his jaw clenched slightly, the only sign that he was worried. She's quite confident you're Olivia. Already planning how to spend the Matthews money, I imagine. He moved closer but stopped when I held up my hand. Katie, listen. Don't call me that. I cut him off, my voice sharp. Only my husband calls me Katie, and right now, I'm looking at a stranger. This isn't what you think, he started. But I laughed, the sound hollow and cold. Really? Because I think it's exactly what I think. You've been sleeping with your 25-year-old assistant for 8 months, and now she's pregnant. Please, tell me what part I'm misunderstanding. He ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of frustration from the usually composed Greg Matthews. It was a mistake. I never meant for any of this to happen. We can fix this. Fix this? I repeated, standing up slowly. Like you fixed things with the Johnson account last year? Or like you fixed things with the offshore investments? Some things can't be fixed, Greg. Some things can only be paid for. His face paled slightly at the mention of the Johnson account. What are you planning? I walked to the window, looking out at the manicured lawn of our Westchester home. Everything. Perfect. Everything controlled. Everything about to change. I'm not planning anything. I'm simply going to enforce the trust's infidelity clause. You remember that clause, don't you? The one that says any beneficiary who commits adultery forfeits their entire share of the trust? You wouldn't, he said. But there was a tremor in his voice now. I already have. I have a meeting with Judge Reynolds tomorrow morning. Eleanor made me co-trustee for a reason, Greg. She knew someday someone would need to enforce that clause. I don't think she expected it would be her favorite grandson, though. He moved toward me, desperation breaking through his composed facade. Kate, please. That trust is my inheritance. It's my future. We can work this out. I'll end things with Olivia. You'll what? I interrupted. Make her disappear? Pay her off? She's carrying your child, Greg. Or did you forget that part? The color drained from his face completely. The child. It could be a mistake. The timing. 10 weeks, I said quietly. That's what she told me. Shall we check your calendar? That business trip to Chicago? The one where you insisted on taking your assistant instead of your wife? He sank into one of the kitchen chairs, the reality of his situation finally hitting him. The great Greg Matthews, brought low by the very legal system he thought he had mastered. What do you want? He asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I walked to my laptop, turning it so he could see the trust documents. I want you to understand exactly what you've lost. $75 million, Greg. Your share of the family trust. Your position at Parker Financial. Because, let's be honest, the board won't keep you once this gets out. And your reputation in Boston's financial community. All gone because you couldn't keep your hands off your assistant. You're going to destroy everything we've built, he said, a note of anger creeping into his voice. No, Greg, I corrected. Him, my voice steady and cold. You destroyed everything we built the moment you decided to sleep with Olivia.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
I'm just making sure you pay the proper price for it. I gathered my laptop and coffee cup, preparing to leave the kitchen. At the doorway, I paused, turning back to him one last time. Oh, and Greg. You might want to call Olivia. She seemed so interested in the Matthews family money. I'm sure she'll be fascinated to learn there won't be any. The next morning, I arrived at the courthouse early. Jennifer was already waiting for me, a thick folder of documents in her hands. In her 15 years as my legal colleague, I had never seen her look so eager. Everything's ready, she said, falling into step beside me. I've compiled all the evidence, emails, hotel receipts, text messages. The private investigator really came through. She lowered her voice. And you won't believe what else I found. I paused, turning to face her. Tell me. Olivia Parker isn't just any assistant. Her father is Richard Parker. The Richard Parker? Of Parker Financial Group? I asked, the pieces suddenly falling into place. Jennifer nodded. The very same. She didn't need this job, or Greg. This was about something else entirely. My mind raced with implications. Richard Parker, the founder of the company where Greg had just been promoted to CFO. The same company currently undergoing a major reorganization with significant shifts in stock ownership. How interesting, I murmured. Get me everything you can on Parker Financial's current restructuring plans. And Jennifer, find out who else at the firm knew about this relationship. 3 months after that fateful morning, I stood on the balcony of my new penthouse overlooking Boston Harbor, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of victory. Greg had lost everything, his inheritance, his executive position, and eventually, Olivia too, once she realized there would be no Matthews millions in her future. The investigation had revealed what I suspected. Olivia had been planted by her father to gain insider information through Greg, information that would have helped Richard Parker consolidate control during the company restructuring. The SEC investigation that followed had ended Richard's career and saved countless shareholders from significant losses. The DNA test had confirmed the child was indeed Greg's, the one genuine element in Olivia's web of deception. But parenthood looked very different from a studio apartment than from a Westchester mansion. As for me, I had emerged stronger than I ever imagined possible. Eleanor Matthews had appointed me as the new trustee of the family foundation, impressed by my integrity in enforcing the clause even against my own husband. Sometimes the most painful betrayals lead us to our true purpose. The trust now funded scholarships for women entering law school, a fitting legacy from a woman who understood that knowledge of the law was the ultimate protection. What I initially thought was the end of my world became the beginning of something far more meaningful. As Eleanor had told me years ago, True power isn't in what you control, but in what you build from what tries to break you. If this story resonated with you, please share in the comments a time when betrayal ultimately led you to something better. And don't forget to subscribe. Tomorrow's video reveals how I turned my legal expertise into a platform helping thousands of women protect themselves financially before disaster strikes. Judge Reynolds' chambers were exactly as I remembered them. Leather-bound law books lining oak shelves, the scent of lemon polish mingling with old paper, and a view of the courthouse gardens through tall windows. The judge herself sat behind, her imposing desk, silver hair pulled into a perfect chignon, reviewing the documents Jennifer and I had prepared. "Catherine," she said, looking up at me over her reading glasses, "these allegations are quite serious. The evidence appears substantial, but enforcing this clause will have far-reaching consequences for your husband." I nodded, smoothing my charcoal pencil skirt as I sat straighter in the chair across from her. "I understand completely, Your Honor. Eleanor Matthews designed this clause specifically to protect the family wealth from exactly this kind of situation." Judge Reynolds sighed, removing her glasses and placing them carefully on the mahogany desk. "I knew Eleanor for 30 years. We were in law school together. She was always formidable in her convictions." "She was," I agreed, memories of Eleanor's sharp wit and sharper legal mind flooding back. The woman had survived the betrayal of 2 husbands in an era when divorced women were social pariahs. She'd built a financial empire despite every obstacle the male-dominated business world could throw at her. When she'd asked me to help revise her family trust 4 years ago, I'd recognized a kindred spirit, someone who understood that in a world that wasn't fair, you created your own justice. "Eleanor appointed me trustee for a reason," I continued. "She believed in consequences." Judge Reynolds studied me, her experienced eyes taking in my composed exterior. "This isn't just about the money, is it, Catherine?" I met her gaze directly. "The Matthews Family Trust represents more than financial assets, Your Honor. It represents Eleanor's legacy, her belief that wealth comes with responsibility. Greg didn't just betray me, he betrayed everything the trust stands for." The judge nodded slowly, reaching for her pen. "I'll enforce the provisions as written. The infidelity clause is clear and unambiguous. Gregory Matthews forfeits his share of the trust, effective immediately." As she signed the order, my phone vibrated with an incoming text. I glanced down discreetly to see a message from my private investigator. "Meeting in progress. Parker and Matthews at Verona restaurant. Photos incoming." I allowed myself a small, cold smile. Greg was digging himself even deeper. "Thank you, Your Honor," I said, gathering my documents as Jennifer began organizing the evidence files. "There's one more matter we need to address, the question of fiduciary responsibility at Parker Financial Group." Judge Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "You believe there are potential securities violations?" "I do. What began as a personal betrayal appears to have professional implications that shareholders should be concerned about." Outside the courthouse, Boston's financial district gleamed in the morning sunlight, the glass towers reflecting clouds, as though nothing had changed. But everything had. The legal machinery I'd set in motion would transform Greg's carefully constructed world into quicksand beneath his feet. Jennifer hurried alongside me as we descended the courthouse steps. "The CC filing is ready whenever you want to pull the trigger," she said, her voice low despite the busy street around us. "And the board members I've contacted discreetly are concerned, to say the least." "Let's wait for the private investigator's report," I replied, pulling out my phone as more photos arrived. The images showed Greg and Richard Parker in what appeared to be an intense discussion at a corner table of Verona, Boston's most exclusive restaurant. Their body language told me everything. Greg leaning forward, hands gesturing desperately. Parker sitting back, arms crossed, expression cold. "He's panicking," I observed. "Good. Let's see how he handles losing $75 million. and potentially his career in the same morning. Back at my office, ironically, just 3 floors below Greg's at the firm where we'd both worked for the past decade, I settled in to wait. News traveled quickly in Boston's financial community, especially news that affected stock prices and executive stability. I had already drafted emails to Parker Financial's board of directors, attaching proof of Greg's indiscretions and the potential compromise of corporate ethics. Not surprisingly, my phone began ringing within the hour. Catherine Matthews. I answered smoothly, though I recognized the number immediately. "What have you done?" Olivia demanded, her voice shaking with emotion that sounded more like fear than anger. "My job," I replied simply. "Enforcing legally binding agreements. Something your father should understand quite well given his position." There was a long pause. "My father just called me. He's furious. He says Greg might have compromised the entire restructuring plan." "Your father?" I repeated innocently. "Oh, you mean Richard Parker, CEO of Parker Financial Group?" "The same. Richard Parker, whose company is about to undergo a major reorganization that my husband, soon-to-be ex-husband, was overseeing as CFO? That must be awkward." "This isn't what you think," she began, but I cut her off. "Actually, Olivia, I think this is exactly what I think. You used your father's connections to secure a position close to the lead financial officer handling your father's company's restructuring. Now you're conveniently pregnant with his child. The only question is whether this was planned from the beginning or just a fortunate coincidence for corporate espionage. You're going to regret this," she hissed, but the fear in her voice was unmistakable. "No, Olivia, you're going to regret this. Because right now, your father is realizing that his entire corporate strategy might be compromised, and Greg is about to lose everything. His money, his position, his reputation. I wonder how interested he'll be in playing happy family with you when he's facing an ethics investigation and possible criminal charges." I ended the call as another came in, this time from the firm's senior partner, William Harrington. "Catherine," he said gravely, "we need to discuss Gregory's situation." "Indeed we do," I agreed, my voice professional. "I assume you've received my email regarding the potential ethics violations?" "It's concerning," he admitted. "We're calling an emergency board meeting. Your presence would be appreciated, given your unique perspective on this matter." I smiled, though he couldn't see it. "Of course. I'll bring all relevant documentation, including the trust order from Judge Reynolds." As I gathered my materials for the board meeting, my assistant appeared in the doorway. "Greg's here," she said quietly. "He's demanding to see you." I nodded, taking my time organizing my files. "Let him wait. I have a feeling he's about to learn a valuable lesson about consequences." Through my office window, I could see Greg pacing in the reception area, his usually perfect appearance showing signs of strain. His tie was loosened, his hair disheveled, a far cry from the polished CFO who had seemed untouchable just yesterday. "Tell him," I instructed my assistant, "that I'll see him at the board meeting and make sure security is nearby. Something tells me this won't be a quiet discussion." The Parker Financial Group boardroom had always impressed visitors with its old-world grandeur. 20-foot ceilings, a table crafted from a single massive tree, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Boston Harbor. Today, that same room felt like a courtroom, and Greg was about to face a jury of his peers. I sat midway down one side of the table, directly opposite where Greg usually sat near the head. William Harrington, the senior partner, took the chairman's position today, a telling sign of how quickly Greg's authority was eroding. The other board members filed in silently, their faces grim. Everyone had read my email. Everyone understood what was at stake. Greg burst in last, his face flushed with anger. He'd clearly been drinking, something I'd never seen him do during business hours in our 12 years of marriage. His eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, I saw something dangerous flash across his face. "You manipulative," he snarled, taking a step toward me. Two security guards immediately moved forward from their positions by the door, but I held up my hand to stop them. "Please, Greg," I said calmly. "Let's keep this professional. We wouldn't want to add workplace intimidation to your growing list of problems." William Harrington cleared his throat. "Gregory, sit down. This is still a board meeting, and we will maintain decorum." Greg laughed bitterly, but took his seat. "Decorum? My wife has just destroyed my life, and you want decorum? Your life?" I raised an eyebrow. Interesting choice of words. Let's talk about destroying things, shall we? I opened my laptop, connecting it to the boardroom's display system. "Mr. Harrington, members of the board, I've prepared a comprehensive presentation of the situation we're facing." The first slide appeared, a timeline of Greg's affair with Olivia, complete with hotel receipts, email exchanges, and surveillance photos. Several board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "This alone would be deeply concerning," I continued, my voice steady. "A chief financial officer having an affair with his assistant hardly projects the image of sound judgment, Parker. Financial wants to maintain, but it gets worse." I clicked to the next slide. Olivia Parker isn't just any assistant. She's the daughter of Richard Parker, founder and CEO of this company, a fact she concealed during the hiring process by using her mother's maiden name on her application. The room erupted in murmurs as Greg's face went from red to white. "That's not," he started, but I cut him off. "Not what? Not a massive conflict of interest? Not a potential ethics violation that could destroy this firm's reputation? Not a betrayal of everything this company stands for?" I turned to face the board directly. "And now Ms. Parker is pregnant with Gregory's child. Imagine the headlines. If this gets out while we're in the middle of a major corporate restructuring." William Harrington removed his glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Gregory, is this true? All of it?" Before Greg could answer, the boardroom door opened. Again, Richard Parker himself walked in, his face a mask of barely contained fury. Behind him was Olivia, tears streaming down her face. "Oh, it's true," Parker said, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "My daughter just confirmed everything, though she neglected to tell me about her condition." He turned to Greg, eyes cold as winter. "I trusted you with my company's financial future, Matthews. Instead, you were busy seducing my daughter." Greg stood up, desperation clear in his voice. "Richard, I can explain. This doesn't affect the restructuring plan. I've kept everything completely separate." "Separate?" I interrupted, clicking to the next slide. "Then perhaps you'd like to explain these emails, the ones where you discuss restructuring strategy with Olivia, or these phone records showing calls to Hamilton Investments right after your business dinners together?" The color drained from Richard Parker's face. "Hamilton Investments? They're our main competitor for the Morrison acquisition." I smiled coldly. "It seems your daughter wasn't the only one playing both sides, Mr. Parker. Gregory has been hedging his bets. Those calls were to Hamilton's finance department. I'm sure the Securities and Exchange Commission will be very interested in reviewing them." Olivia stepped forward, her designer dress now wrinkled, her perfect makeup smeared with tears. "Greg, you promised me. You said we would be together, that you'd take care of everything." "Olivia, please," Greg pleaded, his composure completely shattered. "Not now." "Yes, now," she cried, one hand unconsciously moving to her stomach. "I'm carrying your child, and you've been manipulating everything." Was any of it real? I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then I remembered her sitting in my dining room that morning, so smug, so certain of her victory. "Mr. Harrington," I said, turning to the senior partner, "I've already prepared a disclosure statement for the SEC. Given the circumstances, I believe the firm needs to take immediate action to protect its interests and its shareholders. William Harrington nodded. Slowly, Gregory Matthews, you are hereby suspended from all duties at Parker Financial Group, effective immediately. Security will escort you to your office to collect personal belongings. You can't do this, Greg said, his voice cracking. This is my career. I've given 15 years to this firm. Actually, I interjected, according to the partnership agreement, any partner found to have violated ethical guidelines can be removed by a board vote. And given that you've lost your share of the family trust due to the infidelity clause, you no longer meet the capital requirements to maintain your senior partnership anyway. Greg turned to me, and for the first time, I saw real fear in his eyes. Catherine, please. Everything we've built together. Save it. I cut him off. You should have thought about that before you decided to sleep with your assistant and compromise our largest client's restructuring plan. I turned to Richard Parker. Mr. Parker, I want to assure you that Parker Financial takes this breach very seriously. I'll personally oversee the transition of the restructuring project to a new team. Parker nodded curtly. We'll discuss the future of the restructuring later. Right now, I need to have a very serious conversation with my daughter about her role in all this. He grabbed Olivia's arm, pulling her toward the door. And Matthews, expect to hear from my personal attorneys. As they left, Greg sank back. Into his chair, all his arrogance finally stripped away. Years of power, prestige, and privilege, gone in a single morning. Catherine, he said softly as I packed up my laptop. What am I supposed to do now? I paused, looking at him one last time. That's not my problem anymore, Greg, but I hear there are plenty of regional firms looking for junior financial analysts. You might want to start there, assuming the SEC allows you to keep your licenses. As I walked out of the boardroom, my heels clicking against the hardwood floors, I felt lighter than I had in years. Greg had always prided himself on being the smartest person in any room, the one who could outmaneuver anyone. But he'd forgotten one crucial detail. I had learned from watching him, and I had just beaten him at his own game. Security guards were already approaching his office as I passed by. Through the glass walls, I could see him standing there, staring at the view of Boston Harbor, a view he would never see from this office again. His empire was crumbling, and he had no one to blame but himself. My phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer. Judge Reynolds signed the final trust order. It's done. I smiled, stepping into the elevator. Greg had lost everything. His money, his position, his reputation, and his future. Somewhere, I was certain Eleanor Matthews was smiling, too. Her infidelity clause had finally served its purpose, though I doubt even she could have predicted it would be used against her favorite grandson. The next morning, I arrived at the office early. The firm was buzzing with whispers and sidelong glances. News travels fast in Boston's financial community. Greg's nameplate had already been removed from his office door, the space inside dark and empty. It was remarkable how quickly a 15-year career could be reduced to a few cardboard boxes. Jennifer met me at my office door, tablet in hand. The Boston Business Journal wants a statement about Greg's departure, and the ethics board has scheduled an emergency hearing for next week. She paused, lowering her voice. Also, Richard Parker has filed a formal complaint with the Securities Commission. I settled behind my desk, taking a moment to enjoy my coffee. Forward all press. Inquiries to the firm's PR team. As for the ethics board, make sure they receive the complete file. Every email, every phone record, every hotel receipt. Already done, Jennifer nodded, but hesitated before leaving. There's something else. She placed a thick manila envelope on my desk. This came from Eleanor's old private investigator this morning. Apparently, Greg and Olivia weren't as careful as they thought. Inside the envelope were photos, Dozens of them. Greg and Olivia at various hotels, restaurants, private meetings with Hamilton Investments executives. But what caught my eye was a series of photographs taken at Eleanor's summer house in Cape Cod, the same house where we'd celebrated our anniversaries, where we'd planned to start a family when our careers allowed. "When were these taken?" I asked, my voice tight. "Last month," Jennifer replied. "The weekend you were in New York for the Bar Association conference." The anger I'd been controlling so carefully threatened to surface. Using Eleanor's house, that was a special kind of betrayal. I took a deep breath, reminding myself that revenge was best served cold. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It was Olivia. "We need to talk. Please. There's more you need to know." I showed the message to Jennifer, who raised an eyebrow. "Are you going to meet her?" "Of course," I replied, already typing a response. "But on my terms. Tell security to expect her in an hour. And Jennifer, have someone from HR sit in. I want everything on record." The next hour passed with glacial slowness as I prepared for whatever new drama Olivia was bringing to my door. I reviewed the trust documents once more, ensuring every detail was perfect. Eleanor had built an empire on attention to detail, and I wasn't about to let her down now. When Olivia arrived, she looked nothing like the confident young woman who had sat in my dining room just days ago. Her designer clothes were wrinkled, her makeup hastily applied, her eyes red and puffy from crying. Margaret from HR sat quietly, in the corner, laptop open, ready to document every word. "Mrs. Matthews," Margaret began, but I raised my hand. "It's Ms. Walker now," I corrected, reverting to my maiden name. "I've already filed the divorce papers." Olivia flinched at that, but took the seat across from my desk, clutching an expensive leather portfolio to her chest like armor. "I needed to tell you about Greg," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "About the restructuring plan and other things." I leaned back in my chair, studying her carefully. "More ethics violations? Or is this about the pregnancy?" She twisted her hands in her lap, avoiding my gaze. "Both." The word hung in the air between us for a long moment before she continued. "Greg wasn't just sharing confidential information with me. He was selling information to Hamilton. Investments, using me as a cover for his meetings." Margaret's fingers flew across her keyboard, documenting every word as Olivia continued. "And the baby." She paused, tears welling up. "I'm not really 10 weeks pregnant. I'm 14 weeks, and it might not be Greg's." I kept my face carefully neutral, though inside I was laughing at the irony. Might not be? There was someone else? She nodded miserably, her composure crumbling completely. "Thomas Hamilton, the CEO's son. He runs their mergers and acquisitions team." The pieces fell into place with stunning clarity. This wasn't just corporate espionage. It was a calculated manipulation from multiple angles. "I see," I said quietly. "And Greg doesn't know?" "No," she admitted, her voice barely audible. I thought if he believed it was his, he'd leave you, take care of us with the Matthews money." "How did that work out for you?" I asked coldly. She broke down completely then, mascara running down her cheeks. "My father has cut me off. The firm is investigating me. Hamilton Investments has denied all contact with me. My whole life is ruined." "Your life is ruined?" I repeated, my voice sharp as a blade. "You came into my home, slept with my husband, tried to manipulate your way into my family's money, and participated in securities fraud. Now you want sympathy?" "I'm sorry," she sobbed. "I never meant for it to go this far." Greg and Thomas said a lot of things, didn't they?" I interrupted. "They told you about the Matthews money, about the power you'd have, about the future you'd share. But neither of them mentioned that Greg's entire inheritance depended on Fidelity, did they? Neither mentioned that corporate espionage carries criminal penalties? Olivia shook her head miserably. And now here you are, I continued. Pregnant with possibly another man's child, your father's company compromised, your reputation destroyed, your future uncertain. Tell me, was it worth it? Margaret cleared her throat. Ms. Parker, given these admissions, I need to inform you that your employment at Parker Financial Group is being terminated, effective immediately. Security will escort you to clear out your desk. Olivia stood on shaky legs, clutching her portfolio. What am I supposed to do now? I looked at her coldly. That's not my concern. But if I were you, I'd be more worried about explaining to your father how you helped compromise his company's restructuring plan. And perhaps you should inform Thomas Hamilton about the baby. I'm sure paternity test results will be interesting to many parties. As security led her away, Jennifer came in with more updates. The ethics board wants to expedite Greg's hearing. Apparently there's been another complaint. Something about offshore accounts tied to the Morrison acquisition? I smiled slightly. Ah, yes, the Cayman Islands accounts. Send them the files from Eleanor's private safe, the ones about the hidden fee structure Greg created for certain acquisitions. Jennifer's eyes widened. You knew about those? Eleanor knew everything, I replied. She kept meticulous records of all Greg's financial indiscretions. She was waiting for the right moment to address them. I guess that moment is now. My phone buzzed with a call from Greg. I let it go to voicemail, already knowing what he wanted. He'd be discovering the offshore account revelations soon enough. His carefully constructed world wasn't just crumbling, it was being systematically demolished, brick by brick. Should I have his things from the house sent somewhere? Jennifer asked. I considered for a moment. Have them delivered to his mother's house in Beacon Hill, along with copies of all the evidence, the affair, the ethics violations, the securities fraud. Everything. She should know exactly why her son lost his inheritance. Looking out my office window at the Boston skyline, I felt a sense of completion. Greg had gambled everything. His marriage, his career, his inheritance, his freedom, on the assumption that he was smarter than everyone else. He'd forgotten that I had learned from the best. Eleanor Matthews herself, a woman who had turned betrayal into an art form of consequences. One more thing, I told Jennifer. Contact the contractor. I want Eleanor's Cape Cod house completely renovated. New furniture, new everything. I think it's time for a fresh start. The following week, the ethics board hearing was scheduled for 9 a.m. at the Massachusetts Bar Association building. I arrived early, watching as the various players in this drama filtered into the historic courthouse-style room. Margaret from HR sat near the front, files neatly organized before her. Several Parker Financial board members occupied one side, their faces grim. Greg's mother, Vivian Matthews, sat in the back row, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, but her face drawn with worry. She avoided my gaze. The copies of evidence I'd sent had clearly done their job. All files are ready, Jennifer whispered, setting down a leather briefcase beside me. The offshore account documentation, the Hamilton investments evidence, everything. She paused, checking her phone. And there's something else. Olivia Parker just checked into Massachusetts General. Apparently, there are complications with her pregnancy. I absorbed this information silently. Despite everything, I felt a twinge of sympathy for Olivia. She was young and foolish and had played a game far beyond her capabilities. But sympathy wouldn't stop what was coming next. Greg arrived flanked by two attorneys from a rival firm. He looked haunted, his usual confident stride replaced by the hesitant steps of a man walking to his own execution. His eyes met mine briefly, and I saw a flash of desperate pleading in them. The ethics board members filed in, 5 senior attorneys, and judges who held the power to end Greg's financial career. Judge Reynolds was among them, her face stern as she took her seat at the center of the panel. "This ethics hearing is now in session," she announced, her voice carrying through the now silent room. "We are here to address serious allegations of professional misconduct against Gregory Matthews, former Chief Financial Officer of Parker Financial Group." Greg's lead attorney stood. "Your Honors, before we begin, my client would like to make a statement." Judge Reynolds nodded. "Proceed." Greg rose slowly, straightening his tie, a nervous habit I'd observed countless times during our marriage. "Members of the board," he began, his voice hoarse. "I admit to exercising poor judgment in my personal life, but my professional conduct has always been—" "Objection," I called out, standing. "As a complainant, I have evidence that directly contradicts this claim." Mr. Matthews's poor judgment wasn't confined to his personal life. It extended to securities violations, conflict of interest, and misappropriation of confidential information. I opened the leather briefcase, removing the first set of documents. Exhibit A: records of offshore accounts used to hide fees from the Morrison acquisition. Mr. Matthews deliberately misled both the board and clients about the true cost structure. Greg's attorneys scrambled to respond, but I wasn't finished. Exhibit B: documentation of Mr. Matthews sharing privileged company information with Olivia Parker, who then passed this information to Thomas Hamilton of Hamilton Investments, a direct competitor bidding on the same acquisitions. The room erupted in murmurs. Vivian Matthews let out a small gasp from the back row. "Furthermore," I continued, "Mr. Matthews used his position as CFO to manipulate corporate resources for personal gain. The Cape Cod property, owned by the Matthews Family Trust, was used for unauthorized meetings with competitors, all while billing the firm for supposed client development." Judge Reynolds leaned forward. "These are extremely serious allegations. Ms. Walker, do you have documentation to support all of them?" "Every single one," I replied, patting the thick stack of files before me, including surveillance photos, bank records, and email correspondence. Eleanor Matthews kept meticulous records. Greg's face had gone ashen. Eleanor knew? All this time? "Eleanor knew everything," I said, turning to face him directly. "She was waiting to see if you'd follow in your grandfather's footsteps or forge a better path." "Congratulations, Greg. You exceeded her worst expectations." His lead attorney requested a brief recess, practically dragging Greg from the room. I could hear their heated whispers in the hallway. They were realizing just how thorough Eleanor's documentation had been. Jennifer appeared at my elbow with a fresh update. "Olivia's doctor called. She's asking for Greg. Apparently, there's been a serious development with the pregnancy." I nodded. "Make sure the ethics board knows about this. His response to this crisis will be telling." When the hearing resumed, Greg looked defeated. His attorneys had clearly advised him of the futility of fighting against Eleanor's evidence. "Members of the board," his lead attorney announced, "in light of the evidence presented, my client wishes to voluntarily surrender his financial licenses pending a full investigation of these matters." Judge Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "And the offshore accounts? The mishandled client funds?" "We will cooperate fully with any investigation," the attorney replied. "Mr. Matthews also agrees to make full restitution of any misappropriated funds." I stood again. "Your Honors, while I appreciate Mr. Matthews's belated attempt at cooperation, there's still the matter of criminal liability. The offshore accounts and securities violations may interest the U.S. Attorney's Office." Greg's head snapped up, his eyes widening. "Catherine, you wouldn't—" "I already have," I replied calmly. "The U.S. Attorney's Office received copies of all documentation this morning. They're particularly interested in the wire transfers to the Cayman Islands." The ethics board members conferred briefly before Judge Reynolds spoke again. "This board accepts Mr. Matthews's voluntary surrender of his licenses. We are referring all evidence of potential criminal activity to the appropriate authorities." Mr. Matthews, you are hereby prohibited from practicing in financial services in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, effective immediately. As the hearing concluded, I gathered my materials while watching Greg slump in his chair, his career and reputation in ruins. His mother approached him, her voice carrying across the now emptying room. "Your grandmother would be ashamed," Vivian said quietly. "She built this legacy from nothing, and you've destroyed it all. For what? An affair with your assistant? Inside information to pad your bonuses?" Greg didn't respond, his eyes fixed on the floor. His attorneys were already leaving, no doubt rushing to distance themselves from the scandal. Jennifer approached with another update. Massachusetts General called again. "Olivia's condition has worsened. She's asking for you specifically." I paused, considering. "Tell them I'll be there in an hour. And Jennifer, make sure our PR team is ready. Once the U.S. Attorney's Office moves forward, this is going to be front-page news." As I left the Bar Association building, I saw Greg standing alone on the steps, staring out at the city he'd once dominated. His world hadn't just crumbled. It had been systematically dismantled, piece by piece, using the very tools he'd taught me to wield. Eleanor had always said that financial management was like chess. It wasn't enough to make one good move. You had to see 10 moves ahead. Greg had played checkers, thinking only of his immediate gratification. I had played chess, and now the game was nearly over. Massachusetts General Hospital's maternity ward was quieter than I expected. The nurse led me down a sterile hallway to a private room where Olivia lay looking smaller and younger than ever in the hospital bed. Her father, Richard Parker, stood by the window, his usually commanding presence diminished by worry. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly as I entered. "I know you have no reason to be here." "What happened?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. Olivia turned to face me, her eyes red from crying. "I lost the baby," she whispered. "There were complications. The doctor said it was stress-related." I sat in the chair beside her bed, studying her face. The smug young woman who had sat in my dining room just days ago was gone, replaced by someone who looked utterly broken. "Greg hasn't come," she continued, her voice cracking. "I called him when it started, but he said he couldn't deal with this right now." Richard Parker's jaw tightened. "That coward, after everything he's done." "Dad, please," Olivia interrupted. "I need to tell Catherine something. About the baby. About everything." I waited as she gathered herself, watching as she twisted the hospital blanket between her fingers. "I lied before," she began, "about not knowing who the father was. I knew all along it wasn't Greg's. It was Thomas Hamilton's." The name hit me like a physical blow. Hamilton, the son of Parker Financial's biggest competitor. "The affair with Greg," I said slowly. "It was never about him, was it?" Olivia shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "Thomas wanted information about the restructuring, about which companies Parker Financial was targeting for acquisition. He knew Greg had inside information but couldn't access it directly, so he asked me to get close to Greg, to find evidence we could use." Richard Parker stepped forward. "What are you talking about, Olivia?" "I'm so sorry, Dad," she sobbed. "Thomas promised he'd help Hamilton Investments acquire the right companies if I could prove which targets Parker Financial was pursuing. He said it would give them leverage in negotiations. I never meant for it to go so far." I sat back, processing this new information. So Greg wasn't just compromising company information, he was being manipulated by someone who was playing an even deeper game. "There's more," Olivia said quietly. "In Greg's office, there's a safe behind the Rothko print. Inside, there's a USB drive with everything. All the offshore transactions, the real acquisition targets, communications with banks in the Cayman Islands and Singapore. I saw him access it once when he thought I was sleeping in his office after working late. Richard Parker had gone pale. How much money are we talking about? Millions, Olivia whispered. The Morrison acquisition fees were 3 times what was reported to the board. Greg took his cut through a series of offshore transfers. That's why he was so desperate to keep me close. He thought I was just a naive assistant who had stumbled onto his secret. I pulled out my phone, typing quickly. Jennifer, get me Judge Reynolds. Tell her it's urgent. And contact the U.S. Attorney's Office. They'll want to execute a search warrant on Greg's office immediately. As I stood to leave, Olivia reached for my hand. Catherine, I'm sorry for everything. I never thought about how this would affect real people, you, my father, even Greg. I was just playing a part, but somewhere along the way, it all became real. I looked at her hand on mine, then back at her face. Actions have consequences, Olivia. You played with people's lives like they were pieces on a chessboard. The fact that you were a pawn in someone else's game doesn't change that. Richard. Parker walked me to the door. What happens now? Now Greg faces criminal charges for securities fraud and wire fraud. The U.S. Attorney will be very interested in both the offshore accounts and the manipulation of acquisition information. I paused. As for Hamilton Investments, I suggest you have your legal team review all communications with Thomas Hamilton. Something tells me his hands aren't clean in this either. My phone buzzed. Jennifer again. The U.S. Attorney's Office just arrived at Parker Financial with a search warrant. Greg tried to access his office, but security stopped him. He's becoming volatile. Have them check behind the Rothko, I instructed. And Jennifer, make sure all security footage is preserved. I have a feeling Greg's reaction to this search will be very interesting to prosecutors. As I left the hospital, I received another text, this one from Vivian Matthews. Eleanor's private investigator found more accounts, Zurich, Singapore. Greg's been busy. I smiled, remembering Eleanor's words from years ago. The worst betrayals often have the longest paper trails. She had taught me to always look deeper, to follow the money, to understand that people's true natures revealed themselves in their desperate moments. The car radio was playing a classical piece, Bach's Art of Fugue, its complex counterpoint echoing through the speakers. How appropriate. Greg's fate had been sealed the moment he decided to betray not just his marriage, but his professional ethics and his family's legacy. Jennifer met me at the entrance to Parker Financial Group, her expression a mixture of professional composure and barely contained excitement. The federal agents found the USB drive exactly where Olivia said it would be, she informed me, keeping her voice low as we walked through the marble lobby toward the elevators. But there's something else. Greg's been attempting to remotely access and delete the firm's acquisition files. Our IT security team blocked his credentials, but he's growing increasingly desperate. Of course he is, I replied, pressing the button for the executive floor. That drive doesn't just contain evidence of the Morrison deal. It contains years of fraudulent transactions, manipulated valuations, hidden fees. Greg didn't just break securities laws occasionally. He built an entire shadow operation around breaking them. The elevator doors opened to reveal a scene of controlled chaos. Federal agents in dark suits moved efficiently between offices, boxing documents and electronic equipment. Several of the firm's executives stood in hushed clusters, their faces pale with shock or flushed with anger. William Harrington spotted me immediately and broke away from a conversation with what appeared to be the lead federal agent. Catherine, he said, his voice strained as he guided me toward a quiet corner. This is unprecedented. The U.S. Attorney's Office has expanded their search warrant to include all executive files for the past 5 years. I nodded calmly. That's because the evidence suggests this wasn't isolated to the Morrison acquisition. How many other deals has Greg overseen since becoming CFO? William paled visibly. 27 major acquisitions. Are you saying all? of them might be compromised? I'm saying all of them need to be reviewed, I replied. Eleanor suspected financial irregularities as far back as the Westfield merger 3 years ago. That's when she began building her file on Greg. The press is already calling, William said, running a hand through his silver hair. The Boston Globe is running a front-page story tomorrow on the Parker financial scandal. Our stock is down 12% on rumors alone. I glanced around the office, noting the agents methodically working through Greg's former space. Send them this, I said, forwarding a document from my phone to Williams. It's Eleanor's original investment. Philosophy statement for the firm, the one emphasizing transparency, client trust, and ethical returns above all else. Let them see exactly how far Greg strayed from the principles Eleanor built this company upon. As William walked away to coordinate with the firm's crisis management team, Jennifer approached again. Greg's attorney called. He's accepting a plea arrangement, wire fraud, securities fraud, and obstruction charges. Minimum of 8 years at a federal facility, full restitution to clients, and permanent bar from the financial industry. I nodded, feeling neither satisfaction nor regret, only a sense of appropriateness. Actions had consequences. Eleanor had understood that fundamental truth better than anyone. The U.S. attorney wants to meet with you tomorrow morning, Jennifer continued. They're particularly interested in the offshore account structure. Apparently, Greg's method of hiding fees was innovative. Schedule the meeting, I replied, and arrange for the firm's forensic accounting team to prepare a comprehensive analysis of all potentially affected transactions. The board will need complete transparency to rebuild investor confidence. My phone buzzed with an incoming call. Richard Parker. I stepped into an empty conference room to take it. Catherine? His voice sounded exhausted. The federal investigators just left Hamilton Investments. Thomas has been placed on administrative leave pending their investigation. The board is meeting now to determine next steps. How is Olivia? I asked, surprising myself with the genuine concern I felt. Richard sighed heavily. The doctors are keeping her overnight for observation. Physically, she'll recover. Emotionally, that's another matter. She was a pawn in a game between Greg and Thomas, though that doesn't excuse her choices. No, it doesn't, I agreed. But she's young enough to rebuild her life, Richard. Unlike some others involved in this mess. That's actually why I'm calling, he said, his voice strengthening with resolve. Our board is requesting your presence at an emergency meeting tomorrow afternoon. With Greg gone and our acquisition strategy compromised, we need someone with both financial expertise and unimpeachable ethics to help navigate this crisis. Someone who understood Eleanor Matthews' vision for the firm. The irony wasn't lost on me. 2 days ago, I had been the scorned wife discovering her husband's infidelity. Now I was being courted to help save the very company where that betrayal had been orchestrated. I'll consider it, I told him. But first, let's see what the federal investigation uncovers. Parker Financial may need more than just guidance. It may need complete restructuring. As day turned to evening, I stood at the window of what had been Greg's corner office, watching the sunset paint Boston Harbor in shades of crimson and gold. The federal agents had finished their initial search, leaving behind sealed evidence, boxes, and a pervasive sense that nothing would ever be the same. My phone buzzed again with a message from Vivian Matthews. Catherine, can we meet? There are things about Eleanor's estate that we should discuss. I responded with a lunch invitation for the following day. Vivian had been surprisingly supportive. Throughout this ordeal, perhaps recognizing that I had done exactly what Eleanor would have wanted, protected the family's legacy at any cost. The renovation crew called with updates about the Cape Cod house. All traces of Greg and Olivia's visits were being systematically erased. New furniture would arrive next week, transforming the space that had once been contaminated by betrayal. As I prepared to leave, William Harrington appeared at the door. The board wants to meet first thing tomorrow morning, he said. We need to discuss the firm's future in light of recent developments. I nodded, gathering my belongings. 9 a.m. works for me. We'll need to address not just the legal and financial fallout, but also client retention strategy and public messaging. After William left, I sat at Greg's former desk, looking at the space he had occupied for so many years. The artwork, the credentials, the family photos, all removed, leaving only the bare bones of an executive office. It was remarkable how quickly a person's professional identity could be stripped away, revealing the hollow core beneath the carefully constructed facade. The drive home felt surreal. The same streets I had traveled thousands of times now seemed different somehow, as if the landscape of my life had fundamentally shifted. My phone rang through the car speakers, Greg's attorney. Ms. Walker, he began formally, I wanted to inform you that Mr. Matthews has authorized me to accept your divorce terms without contest. He's also agreed to relinquish all claims to joint property and assets. That's unexpectedly reasonable of him, I observed, suspicion immediately rising. The attorney cleared his throat uncomfortably. Given the circumstances and the extent of the evidence against him, Mr. Matthews feels it's in his best interest to resolve personal matters as efficiently as possible before his sentencing hearing. Translation: Greg was scrambling to simplify his affairs before facing a federal judge, hoping a clean divorce might somehow mitigate the appearance of his other ethical failures. I'll have Jennifer send over the final paperwork tomorrow, I replied. Please remind your client that the terms include a complete non-disclosure agreement regarding our marriage and its dissolution. As I ended the call, I realized I felt nothing. No anger, no satisfaction, no grief. The emotional connection to Greg had been severed as cleanly as if it had been excised by a surgeon's scalpel. In its place was something cooler and clearer, a recognition that what I had lost wasn't worth mourning. Arriving home, I found a courier package waiting at my door. Inside was a handwritten note from Judge Reynolds, along with a sealed envelope bearing Eleanor's distinctive script. Catherine, Judge Reynolds had written, Eleanor left this with me 5 years ago with instructions to deliver it to you when the time was right. Given recent events, I believe that time has now arrived. Inside the sealed envelope was a letter dated just months before Eleanor's death. My dear Catherine, if you're reading this, then my suspicions about Gregory have proven correct. I've watched him carefully these past years, noting the small compromises, the gradual ethical drift, the growing belief that rules apply to others, but not to himself. These are the same patterns I observed in his grandfather, a brilliant financial, mind corrupted by the belief that his brilliance entitled him to more than his fair share. I've spent my life building not just wealth, but a legacy of integrity. The Matthews name once stood for something in Boston: trust, honesty, responsibility. I cannot allow Gregory to corrupt that legacy, no matter how painful the correction might be. You, Catherine, were never just my grandson's wife. From our first meeting, I recognized in you a kindred spirit, someone who understood that true wealth lies not in accounts and assets, but in living according to one's principles. That is why I appointed you co-trustee. That is why I asked you to help revise the infidelity clause. I was preparing you for this moment. The trust, the firm, our family's legacy, they were always meant for someone who would protect them, not exploit them. You are that person, Catherine. When the dust settles, and it will, remember that destruction is sometimes necessary for renewal. From these ashes, build something stronger, something worthy of the sacrifices made to preserve it. With affection and confidence, Eleanor Matthews. I sat with the letter for a long time, Eleanor's voice echoing in my mind as clearly as if she were sitting beside me. She had known, not just about Greg's potential for betrayal, but about my capacity to handle it when it came. She had seen in me something I hadn't fully recognized in myself, until faced with Olivia sitting at my dining room table, smug and certain in her ignorance of what was coming. The next morning dawned clear and cold, a perfect New England autumn day. I dressed carefully for the board meeting in a charcoal suit Eleanor had given me when I made partner at my law firm, a subtle reminder of her presence in the decisions to come. Jennifer was waiting in the lobby with fresh updates. The federal investigation has expanded to include Hamilton Investments. Thomas Hamilton was taken in for questioning an hour ago. The SEC has halted trading in both Parker Financial and Hamilton stocks pending further investigation. And Olivia? I asked as we walked toward the boardroom. Released from the hospital this morning. Her father's arranged for her to stay at their place in Vermont for the time being, away from the press and the investigation. The boardroom was already full when we arrived. Every member of Parker Financial's leadership team sat around the massive table, faces grim with the recognition that their company's future hung in the balance. Federal investigators had established temporary offices on the floor below, combing through decades of transactions for evidence of additional fraud. William Harrington called the meeting to order, his usual confident demeanor subdued by the gravity of their situation. Before we begin discussing next steps, I believe Catherine has some insights to share regarding Eleanor Matthews's original vision for this firm. All eyes turned to me as I took my place at the table. These were people who, just days ago, had viewed me primarily as Greg's wife, a social appendage to their colleague. Now they looked at me with new awareness, recognizing that I had been Eleanor's chosen instrument all along. Eleanor founded this firm 70 years ago with a simple principle, I began, my voice steady and clear. Financial success need never come at the expense of ethical conduct. In fact, she believed the opposite, that long-term prosperity was only possible when built on a foundation of absolute integrity. I opened the portfolio before me, removing Eleanor's original business plan, yellowed with age but visionary in its clarity. This company lost its way not overnight, but through a series of small compromises, each seemingly inconsequential at the time. Greg's crimes were merely the culmination of a cultural drift that began years ago. Several board members shifted, uncomfortably, aware of their own complicity in allowing Greg's behavior to flourish unchecked. The question before us isn't just how to weather this storm, but whether Parker Financial deserves to survive at all. I let that statement hang in the air, watching as shock registered on their faces. Eleanor would have asked that question, so I'm asking it on her behalf. What is worth salvaging here, and why? For the next 3 hours, we engaged in the most honest conversation the boardroom had witnessed in decades. Senior partners acknowledged warning signs they'd ignored, compensation structures that rewarded short-term gains over ethical conduct, and oversight failures that had allowed Greg's parallel system to operate unchecked. By noon, we had reached a consensus. Parker Financial would voluntarily submit to an independent ethics review, restructure its executive compensation to reward long-term client outcomes rather than transaction volume, and establish an ethics committee with actual enforcement authority. These are significant changes, William observed as the meeting concluded. The kind that will dramatically reshape our operations and, frankly, our profitability in the short term. Yes, I agreed, but they're also the only changes that might restore what matters most: trust. Without that, there is no firm to save. As the board members filed out, William remained behind. The board has voted to offer you the position of interim chief compliance officer, he said. We need someone with both legal expertise and a direct connection to Eleanor's vision to guide us through this transformation. I considered the offer carefully. Taking a leadership role at Parker Financial hadn't been part of my plan when I'd confronted Greg's betrayal. Yet Eleanor's letter suggested she had been preparing me for exactly this moment. Not just to expose corruption, but to help rebuild from its aftermath. I'll accept on one condition, I replied. The firm's name changes to Matthew's Financial Group, reclaiming Eleanor's legacy and drawing a clear line between past and future. William nodded slowly. I believe the board will support that. Eleanor built this firm. It's time her name stood alone on the door. My phone buzzed with a message from Jennifer. My lunch with Vivian Matthews was confirmed at the Harbor Club. In 30 minutes. As I gathered my materials to leave, William paused at the door. Catherine, he said quietly, I've known Greg for 15 years. I thought I understood him. How did you see what the rest of us missed? I thought about Eleanor's letter, about the lessons she had taught me through both words and example. I learned from someone who understood that character isn't revealed in moments of ease, I replied. It's revealed in moments of temptation, when no one seems to be watching. Eleanor was always watching. She taught me to do the same. The Harbor. Club occupied the top floor of a historic building overlooking Boston Harbor. Its polished mahogany and brass fixtures a testament to old Boston money and the power it wielded. Vivian Matthews was already seated at a corner table when I arrived, her elegant posture and perfectly coiffed silver hair reminiscent of Eleanor. Despite being Greg's mother, she had always seemed more aligned with her mother-in-law's principles than with her son's moral flexibility. Catherine, she said, rising to greet me with an unexpected embrace. Thank you for agreeing to meet. I settled across from her, noting the thick leather portfolio on the table beside her water glass. The waiter appeared immediately, and we ordered lunch with the practiced efficiency of two women accustomed to business meetings disguised as social occasions. I owe you an apology, Vivian began once we were alone again. I suspected Greg's ethical drift for some time. I should have done more. You're his mother, Vivian, I replied gently. It's natural to hope for the best in your child. She shook her head, a flash of Eleanor's steel appearing in her eyes. Being a mother doesn't excuse enabling behavior that harms others. Eleanor understood that. It's why she began documenting her concerns years ago, because I couldn't bring myself to see what was happening. Vivian opened the portfolio and withdrew a set of documents bound in blue legal folders. Eleanor left these with her personal attorney with instructions that they be transferred to you if certain events occurred. The attorney contacted me yesterday after learning about Greg's arrest. I accepted the folders, recognizing Eleanor's distinctive organizational system. What are these? The future she envisioned, Vivian replied. Eleanor believed that wealth, true wealth, carried responsibilities beyond mere accumulation or preservation. The first folder contains amendments to the family trust that activate now that Greg has triggered the infidelity clause. I opened it to find comprehensive restructuring of the Matthews family trust, shifting control from individual beneficiaries to a governing board focused on philanthropic investment. My name was listed as chair. The second folder, Vivian continued, contains her vision for the firm, what it should become once the inevitable reckoning occurred. This folder held detailed plans for transforming Parker Financial into a pioneer of ethical investment practices, complete with governance structures, compensation models, and client protection mechanisms designed to prevent future abuses. She knew, I said softly, looking up from the documents. Not just about Greg's potential for betrayal, but about how it would all unfold. Vivian nodded, a sad smile crossing her face. Eleanor understood patterns. She saw in Greg the same qualities that destroyed her first husband's career, brilliant financial instincts paired with moral flexibility and entitlement. History repeats itself unless someone intervenes. That someone being me? I observed. That's why she chose you, Catherine. Not despite your background, but because of it. You grew up with nothing, built your career through merit and integrity, and understood the law as a tool for justice, not exploitation. You were the antibody to the disease she saw growing in the family legacy. Our lunch arrived, and we paused our conversation as the waiter arranged our plates. When he departed, Vivian continued in a quieter voice. "There's something else you should know. The pregnancy complications. They weren't entirely unexpected." I set down my fork. "What do you mean?" "Olivia has a history of using pregnancy, real or claimed, to manipulate situations. It happened twice before, at other firms where she worked. Eleanor's investigator uncovered it years ago when Greg first hired her, but Greg dismissed the concerns as old-fashioned moralizing. I absorbed this information, pieces clicking into place. So, the pregnancy was real, according to medical records, Vivian confirmed. But the timing and paternity were almost certainly calculated. The miscarriage, however, was not. Sometimes even the most carefully constructed manipulations encounter biological realities. I thought about Olivia in that hospital bed, her scheme collapsing around her along with her physical health. It was difficult to maintain anger towards someone whose punishment had been so comprehensive. "What will happen to her now?" I asked. "Richard is arranging for extensive therapy at a private facility in Switzerland, away from Boston, away from the investigation, away from the press. She's young enough to rebuild if she chooses to learn from this, rather than simply plotting her next manipulation." We finished our lunch, discussing practical matters of trust administration and the legal transition ahead. As we prepared to leave, Vivian reached across the table and grasped my hand. "Eleanor would be proud of how you've handled this, Catherine. Not just the exposure of wrongdoing, but your vision for what comes next. Destruction without rebuilding is just vengeance. Rebuilding something better, that's justice." I squeezed her hand in return. "Thank you for that. And for standing with me through this, despite him being your son. Gregory made his choices," she said, her voice firm. "Now he faces the consequences. But the Matthews legacy is bigger than any one person's mistakes. Eleanor understood that. So do you." The afternoon passed in a blur of meetings. First, with federal prosecutors eager to understand the full scope of Greg's financial schemes. Then with the firm's crisis management team working to stabilize client relationships. By evening, I found myself back at Eleanor's Cape Cod house, now my house, watching contractors measure for new windows that would transform the space that had witnessed so much betrayal. Standing on the deck overlooking the Atlantic, I felt a sense of completion washing over me with each wave that crashed against the rocky shore. The renovation foreman approached with questions about the master bedroom, and I made decisive choices about walls to remove and spaces to open, physical manifestations of the emotional clearing that had occurred in my life. My phone rang, Jennifer with an update that couldn't wait until morning. "The federal investigation has expanded dramatically," she reported. "Based on evidence from Greg's drives, they've opened inquiries into 3 other financial firms. Apparently, this wasn't isolated to Parker Financial. Greg was part of a network of executives manipulating acquisitions across the industry." That tracks with Eleanor's suspicions," I replied, watching the sunset paint the ocean in shades of amber and gold. She believed the problem was systemic, not just personal. "There's more," Jennifer continued. "Thomas Hamilton has turned state's evidence. In exchange for leniency, he's providing details about the entire operation, including evidence that Greg was planning to leave the country next month with substantial hidden assets." The timing struck me immediately. Next month was our anniversary. "Trip to the Maldives," I observed, feeling a fresh wave of betrayal at the realization that what I'd thought was a romantic gesture had actually been an escape plan. "The U.S. attorney wants you to testify before the grand jury next week," Jennifer added. "They believe your perspective as both a trust attorney and the person who uncovered the scheme will be compelling." I agreed to the testimony, knowing it was necessary not just for legal proceedings, but for the broader reckoning the industry needed to face. As I ended the call, a text message appeared from Richard Parker. "Board approved your recommendations unanimously. Matthews Financial Group launches next quarter. Thank you for saving what could be saved." 1 year later, I stood at the podium in the Harvard Business School auditorium, preparing to deliver a guest lecture on ethical leadership in financial services. Through the windows, autumn painted Harvard Yard in brilliant reds and golds, a reminder that even endings could be beautiful when they led to necessary renewal. The students settled into their seats, many already familiar with what the media had dubbed the Matthews Doctrine, the comprehensive ethics framework now being adopted by financial firms nationwide in the wake of the scandal that had revealed systemic corruption in Boston's financial sector. True power, I began, looking out at the sea of faces, doesn't come from accumulation of money, information, or influence. It comes from alignment, when your actions, your values, and your impact on others exist in harmony. From my position, on stage, I could see Jennifer in the audience, now Chief Operating Officer of Matthews Financial Group. Beside her sat Vivian Matthews, representing the family foundation that had become a leading force for reform in financial education. A year ago, I stood in my kitchen listening to my husband's assistant tell me she was pregnant with his child, I continued, noting how the students leaned forward at this personal detail they'd all read about in case studies. In that moment, my world seemed to be ending. But sometimes what feels like an ending is actually a beginning. I explained how the investigation that began with one man's betrayal had uncovered an entire ecosystem of financial manipulation, leading to regulatory reforms now enshrined in what Congress had named the Financial Integrity Act. Eleanor Matthews, who founded what is now Matthews Financial Group, used to say that character isn't built in moments of comfort. I told them, it's forged in moments of crisis, when faced with choices that reveal who you truly are. After the lecture, as students gathered to ask questions, a young woman approached hesitantly, waiting until the others had dispersed. Ms. Walker, I'm Emily Hamilton, Thomas Hamilton's daughter. I studied her face, seeing none of her father's calculation, but rather a genuine discomfort with her family connection. I wanted to thank you, she continued, her voice strengthening. What happened with my father and your husband? It opened my eyes. I'm starting business school next fall, and I want to specialize in ethical governance. I considered her for a moment, seeing the determination in her eyes. Come see me when you graduate, I told her. Matthews Financial is always looking for leaders who understand the value of integrity. That evening, back at the renovated Cape Cod house, now transformed into a light-filled retreat bearing no resemblance to the space where Greg and Olivia had betrayed me, I reviewed the latest updates from Jennifer. The sentencing phase of Greg's trial had concluded with a 14-year federal prison term. Thomas Hamilton had received 8 years for his cooperation. 3 other executives at competing firms faced similar fates. The regulatory changes sparked by the case had fundamentally altered how acquisitions were structured and reported throughout the industry. Olivia had completed her treatment in Switzerland and was now working for a nonprofit in Seattle, about as far from Boston's financial world as one could get within the continental United States. According to Richard, who maintained minimal contact, she was slowly rebuilding her life with a new appreciation for consequences. The Matthews Family Trust, restructured according to Eleanor's contingency plans, now funded educational initiatives focused on ethics in business and finance. The first class of Matthews Fellows, promising students from disadvantaged backgrounds, would graduate next spring, bringing fresh perspectives to an industry in desperate need of reform. As for me, I had emerged stronger than I could have imagined. The woman who had stood frozen in her kitchen that September morning, watching her world seemingly collapse, had discovered reservoirs of strength, wisdom, and purpose she hadn't known existed. Eleanor's final letter sat framed on my desk, a daily reminder of the legacy I now carried. True power isn't in what you control, but in what you build from what tries to break you. Walking onto the deck, I watched the stars emerge over the Atlantic, each one a reminder of possibilities that existed beyond the horizon of what I could currently see. The betrayal that had been meant to destroy me had instead revealed my true strength. And that was the greatest victory of all. The trust that had been designed to punish infidelity had evolved into something far more meaningful, a vehicle for positive change in an industry desperate for ethical leadership. The firm that had been corrupted by greed was now setting new standards for transparency and client protection. Sometimes the most painful betrayals lead us to our true purpose. What I had initially thought was the end of my world had become the beginning of a legacy far more meaningful than anything Greg and I had built together. As Eleanor had written in her final instructions to me, "From these ashes, build something stronger, something worthy of the sacrifices made to preserve it." Standing there under the vast New England sky, I felt a sense of completion. The game wasn't just over. It had transformed into something entirely new, with different rules, different players, and a different definition of winning altogether. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.